Oh, hi, Donna.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Donna.
Hi. Oh, Terry, good to see
Yes,
you.
and Don.
Oh, Dawn's there too. Great.
You want to say hi? Go ahead.
Hi, Donna, from us too.
Hello.
Hi.
So, Rabbi, I know a lot of people here.
That's it's because of the wonderful practice you're affiliated with, I'm sure.
Oh, partially, not everybody. Thanks for letting me be a part of this.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm anxious.
Hello, Sarah. Sorry about the connection issues. Let's I just as promised, I wanted to begin. There was some reading for not just this class, but some reading for the introductory class that we did. And before we go to the main course of tonight's little exercise, which is an introduction to the Hebrew Bible, I just wanted to entertain any questions that people had about the readings, or any questions hanging on from the last class that people wanted to discuss before we went forward with the next thing we're doing.
No questions. I thought it was a good book, though. I like the way it's written.
I've heard that people like the book. It's the same book I use for my undergraduate class, but because they're undergraduates, I'm kind of suspicious as to whether or not they actually read it. So it's great to have. It's wonderful to have a course where some people at least are doing the reading. I just think that he really brings a lot of love to.
I agree
what he
with
writes.
Terry. I agree. I think it's an excellent book. Did you tell us to read the chapters after each class, Rabbi?
So for the first class there, because it was the first time we met, I didn't have time to assign reading ahead of time. So there was the reading for the first class, which was given after that class. And going ahead, I think it's helpful if people do the reading ahead of time, and then we can deal with any questions right at the moment. But whenever you get to it, we're going to be working on this for a little bit. So whether if you do the reading ahead of time, that's great. If you look at something, or if you just have a question, if the course raises a general question about Judaism that you want to explore, this is an opportunity. I will go ahead and put the PowerPoint on, and if there's while I'm struggling with that, if people have a question, you can hit me with that. Otherwise, we'll dive right in. So this is the, just to review the schedule, this is the second class. Today is June 30th. In 2 weeks, it's going to be a little bit of a deviation. It's not going to be on Wednesday, it will be on Thursday. And you can see the readings to the side, and then the rest of the summer, we will retain our Wednesday evening schedule up until the high holy days. The Jews are often called the people of the book. And usually when that's said, the book that's being referred to is the book of books, the Bible. The title people of the book was never a term that we put on ourselves, because we have more than one book. We have a bunch of books. This is a picture of the Jewish library in Toronto. The number of books that you have to read when you're Jewish are endless. I remember when I entered rabbinical school, my rabbi said, well, now you will never be without something to read, because to be Jewish, you spend your entire life trying to even go toe deep into the great ocean that is Jewish literature, that is our tradition. But it really does go back to a single work that we're going to talk about tonight. And even though it's not exactly accurate to call us the people of the book, it seems that everywhere we turn back to this collection of stories, of laws, in a work that we call the Hebrew Bible. And I'm just going to talk a bit about that, its structure, where we find it in services, how it affects the lives of Jews as we live today. And we'll set the stage to, in the next class, explore the books that are less well known, but are really the critical ones to understand Judaism. That's the rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud, but we will start at the very beginning, a very good place to start. And I always like to begin with a little bit of vocabulary, that because sometimes we use jargon and people get confused and they say, well, what is he talking about? What do we call the Hebrew Bible? Well, I mean, the first thing that I would call it is the Hebrew Bible. That's a very good way to refer to it. But there are other words that we use. One word that you will often heard it used to describe it is Tanakh. And on the right side of the screen is a copy of an English translation of the Hebrew Bible called Tanakh. This is kind of the authorized English edition published by by Jewish Publication Society. I think that took them about 20 years to get it together. It was written between 1965 and 1982, but it's been completed now for 40 years or so, and is an absolutely essential reference in every Jewish library. On the other side, I just have a copy of kind of the academic Hebrew version of it that you'll see people working through sometimes. Another term that we use to describe the Hebrew Bible is the word mikra, which simply means recitation. And this is similar to the term that Muslims use to describe their holy scripture, the Quran. And in fact, the languages of Hebrew and Arabic, they're very close together. And the root of those two words is the same, mikra and Quran. And it simply means recitation. And because we call it this, because the way that it was usually put together was in terms of oral recitation. We recited it. We are very privileged to have lived 500 or 600 years after the invention of the printing press, where books are ubiquitous. But for most of the history of this was something that existed in scrolls that were kept away. And the primary way of teaching it was by memorization and recitation. The next piece that the next term that I'm going to introduce is going to be confusing, but you'll hear it also referred to as the written Torah. The word Torah for Jews has both a specific and sort of a generic sense. When many people talk about the Torah, as we'll see, they say, well, you're talking about the 5 books of Moses, and I'm going to tell you what those are. But Torah is also a generic word for teaching. And so when we say the written Torah, this is the Torah that is written down, as opposed to, as we'll see in the next class, the oral Torah, which is the main scripture of Judaism. The one thing that to be careful not to refer it to as, and rabbis make this mistake sometimes. I was at I was at a concert here in Bangor with a great Jewish musician who kept talking about the Old Testament, and so it's something that even Jews fall into doing. But because we live in a Christian world and Christians call the Hebrew Scriptures the Old Testament, sometimes we fall into the habit of referring it ourselves as that. But that's not a good way to look at it. That's not the way we like to look at it, because we see it has the word old in it. It assumes that it's subordinate to the new and improved testament of Christianity, but also the word testament is weighted in a way that that misleads as to what this is about. So we have the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Mikra, the written Torah. The word Tanakh is an abbreviation of 3 Hebrew words, and those words are Torah, and this is the more limited use of Torah. And this just refers to the 5 books of Moses, and we'll go over exactly what those are. The N comes from Nevi'im, which just means the prophets. And these are, we'll go over exactly what these books are, but these are the historical books, tells the story of the children of Israel from the time of the monarchy all the way to the time of the close to the destruction of the Second Temple. And the final third, the final piece of it is called the Ketuvim, the writings. And these are poetic and philosophical works. So we take the names of these 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, and we make a word out of them, Tanakh. And this is why some people will refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Tanakh. What are the differences between Jewish and Christian conceptions of Scripture? We live primarily, or we used to live primarily, in a Christian society. Religion in general is taking a beating, so it's less Christian these days. But even so, there's when people talk about the Bible in our society, usually they're talking about the Bible in the Christian context. And there's some important differences in the ways that Jews and Christians look at this book. I mean, the first difference between the Jewish and the Christian conceptions of Scripture, I mean, the first one is very easy to tell. There are books in the Christian Scripture that do not exist in the Hebrew Bible. These books are usually what Christians call the New Testament, the Gospels, the writings of Paul, the book of Revelations. And none of these are books in our tradition. These are books that are completely on the outside. So the books that are in the collection are a little bit different. The Hebrew Scripture is not what a testament in the way that Christians refer to their Scripture. That the idea that the Scripture is testimony that you have to affirm or believe, and that it's therefore it's kind of a if it's either you believe it or it doesn't count. That's not our approach to Scripture. Scripture for us is that is a book of history. It's the story of the people of Israel. It's the story of different ideas about things, ways that we have succeeded and ways that we have not succeeded. But it is a book of propositions that are tested, the things that you can consider. It makes certain points. And it is a fact that as you look through the Hebrew Scripture, there are great divergences between different parts as to the worldview and to the theology. Dorsick talks a little bit about the different names of God, and that sometimes that God in our Scripture always has a proper name. That's a difference between Judaism and Christianity. The names for God in Greek, and therefore in the translations of Christian Scripture, are generic, God and Lord. But the names of God in the Hebrew Scripture are proper names, like Dave or Bill. But not Dave or Bill are not names of the Jewish God, but the names that are used for God, Adonai, which is stands in for another name, Elohim, El Shaddai. these are proper names, and that these proper names are sometimes associated with very different theologies and very different points of view, sometimes right next to each other. Our scripture begins with the book of Genesis. It has one chapter which has the name Elohim, and the second chapter has the name Adonai. And they're right next to each other, but God has a different name, and they tell us a little bit of a different story. There's obviously a different interpretive apparatus to them. When you study the Christian scripture, you study it through interpreters like Augustine and the church fathers. When you study Jewish scripture, you study it through the interpretation of the rabbis. And the works which they write to interpret the scripture are the things that we're going to speak about in the next class. And finally, a difference between Jewish and Christian conceptions of scripture, that Judaism is very suspicious of translations. This is something that goes back to the very beginning. The Greek scripture of Christianity is already a translation of the story of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't think that people imagine that Jesus of Nazareth spoke Greek or he delivered these stories in Greek, but the Christian scripture is in Greek, already translated away from the context in which the stories appear. We hold on, we read the Hebrew Bible in the same language that has been read in for over 2,000 years. And the determination to maintain a culture of reading in Hebrew is something that sets Judaism apart. I remember on my journey, I was at the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the very famous instructors in Hebrew Bible there is a very fine gentleman named Jeffrey T. Gay, who some of you may have heard of. And when I was an undergraduate, everybody said, well, you got to take Jeffrey T. Gay's class on the Hebrew Bible. And so I went to talk to him about it. And he said, Bill, you're welcome to take the class, but you need to understand that this is all happening in Hebrew. We read it in Hebrew. Most of the people who come to the class have been reading it in Hebrew their entire life. You're welcome to come along, but you need to realize what the standards we're going to set. And so I decided to put off the class until I had taken some time to really master biblical Hebrew, and then I took the class. But we have translations available. Probably most people who go to synagogues read it through translation, but we have an ethos that the translation is never captures what is in the original, and so we're determined to maintain the original. Like another story from seminary. The Jewish Theological Seminary is right across the corner from Union Theological Seminary, and sometimes we would go over there to take classes. And you study the Christian scripture there. It was the Jewish students that were most worried about getting the Greek right in those books. I mean, even though it wasn't our scripture, we were so culturally attuned to the idea that translations don't work that well, that we made sure that we had the Greek under our belts before we went to do this. And so one aspect and a barrier, and it's a barrier, and we'll have some hints at the end for getting around it, but it is a barrier that both in academic life and in synagogue life, we conduct ourselves primarily in Hebrew. Judaism is very suspicious of translations. Having said that, I'll just review. These are the books of the Hebrew Bible. There are 24 altogether. The first collection we have are what we call the Torah. And the 5 books are very well known, I think: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These tell the story of the creation of the world. Tells how Israel was formed as a nation in exile, and the struggle to build a society, to create institutions that would guide the people. The Nevi'im, the prophets, is the second collection, and here we have the historical books, starting with the account of Joshua and the probably mythological invasion of the land under Joshua. The period of the Judges, the stories of the monarchs of ancient Israel, starting with David and Solomon and continuing all the way to the exile in Babylon. These are the stories that are told in Samuel, Kings, and were related in the literary works of the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. The third and final category of books in the Hebrew Bible is the Ketuvim. These are well-known books. I outlined some of them. Psalms is a book of poetry, which is very strongly represented in Jewish life liturgically. The first thing that we do when we get to synagogue to warm up to pray is we go through a couple of psalms. We do a bunch of psalms out loud, and we'll read them together. We don't usually read them slow enough to think about them. One of the very challenging things is how fast things go in synagogue. But we also have in Ketuvim the 5 things outlined in red called the Megillot, the scrolls. And as we're going to see, the scrolls, the 5 Megillot, are books that are associated with particular Jewish holidays and are read for those holidays. You always have to look at the question: where did this all come from? Why is the Bible considered holy? What's the origin of it? And in some of our other adult education classes, we spend quite a bit of time on this because it's a perplexing problem. But just to give you what the traditional explanation is, that if you just ask like an observant Jew, pick one out, an observant Jew who lived sometime in the last 2,000 years. Where did these come from? These are the explanations that you would be given. These are the answers to the question, where does the Bible come from? The traditional understanding of the Torah, of the first set, is that it was given at Mount Sinai, in this encounter of revelation to Moses. It was given to Moses, and he presented it to the children of Israel on the path of the Exodus from Egypt into ultimately settling the land. This is the historical understanding of, this is the traditional understanding of the Torah. And it's why the first part of it is, in Jewish life, is revered more than the other parts of the Bible. That this was the part that was given by God somehow, and was not the creation of a human being. The second strata, the Nevi'im, the prophets, well, these were written by the prophets. These are their books, either in terms of the poetry or the speeches that they wrote, or the historical accounts of Israel in the period of the first Commonwealth, in the time of between David and Solomon up until the time of the Babylonian exile. And the third area, in the third group, the writings, this was written by some of it by prophets, but many of it by people that were not prophets. These are just interesting books that we've decided to have around, and they're inspirational. And so we keep them as either a historical or a philosophical reference. And in this telling, you have degrees of holiness. The most holy level is the 5 books of the Torah. The second strata of holiness is the works of the prophets, and the final strata of holiness is the writings, that in that order. They're all considered holy, but some books are more holy than others. And this is reflected in the amount of attention that they're given in synagogue life, as I will show you shortly. We do have different answers from scholarship, and one of the stories of being Judaism, one of the stories of Judaism of being Jewish in our times, is how to reconcile the traditional explanations of where these things come from with where we've understood as scholars that they come from. And the understanding of scholars is that the Torah was not given in the wilderness between Egypt and the land, but the Torah was written after the first exile. It was written by the priestly elites during the period of restoration. So that's around the fourth or the fifth or the fourth century BCE, 2,500 years ago. In the scholarly point of view, the other books are older than the Torah. The Torah is the youngest one. The prophets, these are books that do come from the pre-exilic era. So this is before the year 600 BCE. And the writings, they're all over the place. Some are before the period of exile. Some come from the period after the exile. So these are the groupings of the books and how they're reflected in both the traditional understanding as well as the academic understanding. I'm going to go from this to talk about how they are used in worship and how they are used in the synagogue service when they are read. But and then I'm going to talk about sort of like modern times and encountering this in English and how do we go from here. But this is kind of an intense thumbnail of things. And so I'd want to stop here for a moment and see if there's some questions or some comments, things that I could clarify, questions that have been raised, things that I was not clear about that need to be clarified.
I have a question, a general question. Are these slides going to be available, or is the video, are you recording this or are you going to upload it to YouTube or?
So this is being recorded. Well, it's being live streamed, and we capture the live stream and we put it back onto the synagogue website. And I would be delighted to share the slides with anyone who wanted them.
Awesome, thanks.
I want to make one comment about who wrote the Torah. I mean, although I'm sure there are some very traditional Orthodox Jews who accept the critical analysis that was written by the priests and so on. It's a very strong tradition among Orthodox Jews that the Torah was literally dictated to God by Moses, and Moses wrote it down. So those two strains of where did it come from are strong in Judaism.
Absolutely. Okay, I will carry on as best as I can. So when are the books read in the synagogue? And the amount of time spent on each one is reflective of this traditional tendency to elevate the Torah over the other works. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is divided into 54 portions, into 54 parts. And we read one portion of this each week of the year. Now, I know that there are 52 weeks in the solar year. When we get to the calendar of Hebrew, it's a solar calendar, but sometimes we have to double up. And usually there's a couple of portions that we are used to reading together. But we begin to read the Torah each year on Simchas Torah. It's a fall holiday. We begin with Genesis. We read one portion a week until the next Simchas Torah, where we finish and we start over. So the synagogue cycle is a cycle that's defined by where we are each week in the reading of the Torah. I mean, for instance, this week, the parsha, the portion that we're reading is from the book of Numbers. We're about 3/5 of the way through. And it's the parsha is called Pinchas. I mean, that's the word that's called basically from the first word in the portion. But but all around the world, it's the portion of Pinchas. And when rabbis decide what they want to speak about in the synagogue, they're going to be speaking, if they're disciplined, on this portion. All of the op-eds that you'll see will go back to this. The spiritual conversation of the Jewish community that's in synagogue is sort of set by the portion that we're on. We'll talk about Pinchas this week. We'll study the commentaries on Pinchas. And then after Shabbat, we'll go on to the next portion. So for the week afterwards, it's a double portion. It's Matot and Maseh. I'll show you at the end of the class where you can find all of those readings. But it's a yearly cycle, and sort of the agenda of what we talk about is set by which cycle we're in addition to the fact that it takes a significant amount of the time that we spend in the synagogue to do the reading. In liberal congregations, it's customary to shorten the reading a little bit, to not do the whole thing, as usually just to relieve the stress on whoever has to read and to save some time. In my first pulpit, my first venture out of rabbinical school, I was in a congregation that read the whole portion every week, and I was the only Torah reader. And I'd been reading Torah for decades or so before that, so I mostly knew it. But even so, it was a big part of my week would be reviewing the portion, and if just reading the portion from beginning to the end without any interruptions, it takes a good 15 or 20 minutes. And you think about that, we break it up in the synagogue and we have different people take aliyahs. In a traditional synagogue, the reading of the Torah will take roughly 45 minutes to do. We don't do the full thing, so it takes about half an hour to do. It's a little bit shorter, but even in the congregations that abbreviate, you move on to the next portion with everyone else. The entire Jewish world is on the same portion at the same time. So the Torah is, this is a central part of our worship. It's a central part of our education. The first thing that we teach our kids is to memorize certain sections of the Torah. And part of the coming of age ceremony, which we'll get to when we do life cycles, the bar mitzvah, is a large part of that is to teaching the child to master the ability to read a certain portion of the Torah. So all of the Torah is read in the synagogue, and that is the main course of reading. The Nevi'im, the second section of prophets, we take a little bit of it. We don't read all of the Nevi'im in the course of the synagogue year. What happens is we take about 10 to 20 verses from a section of the prophets that corresponds some way with the Torah portion. And this is the same reading in every congregation. We're not making it up as we go along. There's a list of what we do, and the entire Jewish community of the world follows the list. This is called the Haftorah. And this is an honor that is often again given to the bar or the bat mitzvah as part of the reading, but it allows us to include the second segment of the Torah in our worship service. The final piece of the scripture, well, one, I should put Psalms there, because Psalms is in every service. We do a little bit of Psalms to warm up. So Psalms is read as part of the service. But for different holidays, we read different items of what are called the 5 Megillot, which I outlined earlier in red here, part of Ketuvim, the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastics, and Esther. And these are read for the holidays of Passover. We read the Song of Songs. We read Ruth on Shavuot. we read Lamentations on the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av is a fast day, and the Lamentations tells the story of the destruction of Jerusalem. And so we read that to remind us of that. Ecclesiastes is about nature and philosophy and mortality. And so we read that on Sukkot, as just as the world is starting to go to sleep for winter, we see that the days are getting shorter and the nights are longer, and it makes us recognize our own temporal nature. And of course, the book of Esther tells the story of, well, Esther, which is the basis of the holiday of Purim. And so we read it there. These are the liturgical uses of the Hebrew Bible. It's really the backbone of a lot of what happens in synagogue. The things that we read from in synagogue, we rely on our pre-book technology. That before there were books, well, there were codices, but there were also scrolls. And the manner of writing these books in the ancient Near East, well, you had these scrolls. I mean, you also had cuneiform. You had clay tablets, I suppose. We don't use those. That would make the service quite quite more adventurous if we had to lug some clay tablets out of the ark. But we do use the scrolls. And this is the same technology that was used 2,000 years ago to write books down. The parchment is made from animal skin, and the dye is made from natural materials. It's written with a quill, and every scroll that we use for ritual purposes is handmade and is produced in this fashion. It takes a trained scribe about a year to write an entire Sefer Torah for liturgical use. The book of Esther, they can whip out in a few weeks or so. The shorter scrolls they can do. But for all of these things, we use the scrolls. The exception to this is the Haftorah. The Haftorah, unlike the Megillot and unlike the Torah, we allow ourselves to read out of our books simply because they are from different parts of the prophets, and it would be prohibitive you'd have to have a scroll of every one of the prophets. You'd have to look it up. Very few synagogues have the ability to keep all of those things in scrolls. So for the Haftarah, we're permitted to use books. But for everything else, we're required to do the reading on the scroll. And the way that it appears in the Hebrew scroll, well, it appears like this. It's as you can see, it's handwritten. It's in a line. There are rules for how the letters need to be formed. One attribute of Hebrew, and it's an attribute of all of the Semitic languages that use alphabets, is that short vowels are not indicated. That long vowels are written out, but the short vowels have to be memorized. I mean, they don't have to be. There's only 3 of them, so it's not as hard as it looks. But this is what people, this is very intimidating for people. They say, well, Hebrew is written without vowels. How could we ever do it? It takes practice, but it's not like English. If you took the vowels away from English, I think it'd be very difficult to read, because Hebrew is a more inflected language than English is, and it's a smaller vocabulary. For literary purposes, it's actually not as hard as it looks, but it requires some training to do. The way that we write Hebrew without short vowels and without punctuation, you can see that there's nothing here that indicates when one verse ends and another one begins. It has to be memorized. This is the way that Hebrew has always been written. If you look at a page of Talmud, this is a printed edition of the Talmud, you see again, there's no short vowels and there's no punctuation. The punctuation has to be provided by the reader. And this creates situations where different words can be read differently, and there are arguments about how things should be punctuated and how things should be read. And also in modern Hebrew has been revived now for 120 years. If you read an Israeli newspaper, you read a book in Israel, the short vowels aren't indicated. But to help the reading process in liturgy, we do have a system of vowels that is used for the Hebrew of the Bible and is used for the Hebrew of the prayer book. And so when you begin your education with Hebrew, you generally begin with what's called a vocalized text. And the vocalization here are the little dots, the crosses, and it contains both information of how to pronounce the words correctly, so that there won't be any disagreements about how the words should be pronounced. And it provides the melody and the punctuation that we sing our scriptures. We just don't say them. And that's one of the more beautiful parts of the synagogue service is the singing of scripture. So if we were to vocalize this, "Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor la'eved, Echalek b'nakala b'mispar shemot larav." I have this up because I'm reading Torah this week and I need to practice a little bit. But when this is the sort of thing that I would prepare with so that I make sure that I have the pronunciation correct. And then on Saturday, when the spotlight's on, when we're at synagogue, I'll read it from the scroll that will have the writing that looks like this. Because it's difficult for the books that we use in synagogue, we usually have this sort of system of vocalization. This is a page from the Siddur, which is our prayer book, and you can see on one side we have an English rendering of it, so people can look over and they can see the translation. But the Hebrew in the prayer book, you can see it has the same system of crosses and dots and little things to allow the reading to be done as correctly as possible. You should know that Israelis generally don't know this vocalization system that well. They're never exposed to it. And if you're in summer camp and you ask them to put the vowels on something, it's a very dangerous procedure because they have no idea what to do. But their prayer books have them too, but they just don't notice them. But for our prayer books and when we teach Hebrew, we usually teach Hebrew with the vocalization system. And then at one point later, after people work with the vocalization a bit, we take it away. And it's like taking the training wheels off a bicycle. They just ride off, and they never knew that they needed the training wheels in the first place. That becomes very easy to do after a little while. But in synagogue, while I am reading from the scroll, the congregants will be reading along in what's called a Chumash. And I'll show you what it looks like on the outside as we get near the end of it. But the Chumash has all of the readings from scripture for the year for the synagogue printed in this fashion. You have the text written with the vowels so that you can check my pronunciation as I go, or you can check the pronunciation of whoever's doing the Haftarah, make sure they get it exactly right. And there's an English translation off to the side so that you can look over and you can see what it means. The translation is important even for people who have facility with Hebrew, because the language at many times is very difficult. The language in certain spots can be difficult, and you just need to look over and have some recourse to it. So it's not just for beginners, but it's very helpful for beginners, and it allows people hopefully to feel at home in the synagogue. It allows us to bridge the connection between the culture, which is very suspicious of translations and prefers things to be read the way that they have always been read, but also permits contemporary Jews to participate and connect to what is going on. I wanted to give you some. So the question is, and just to before I open up for the questions, I'm near the end of my prepared material, but I want to give guidance to people who are watching the class. Well, I want to read the Hebrew Bible. I don't know Hebrew yet. What do I do? What do I turn to? How do I what are the resources that I have? And there are some great resources in English for people that want to read the Hebrew scripture. The first one I noted in the beginning of the course, and this is the JPS Tanakh, this green book. Sometimes it's in blue, but this is a translation of the entire Hebrew scripture into English, which was made by a committee of scholars in the 60s and 70s. It's some people ask, well, you know, I have a copy of the King James, or I have a copy of the NIV. Can I just tear off the bonus books? Can I just remove the Christian part and use the first part of that book to study the Hebrew scriptures? And it's important to know that in a Christian Bible, the translation often is made with Christian apologetics or Christian theology in mind. And that part of the story that Christians tell is that the Old Testament is the precursor to the New Testament, that the Hebrew scripture is a precursor to the Christian scripture, and they will translate the Hebrew scripture in accordance with that doctrine. So it isn't, I have a copy of the King James, I have a copy of Christian Bibles, I read them from time to time, but starting off for the Hebrew Bible, it's important to have a translation done with the Jewish point of view in mind. And probably the first stop on that is this book, the Tanakh, the Holy Scriptures. This is kind of the consensus English version of the Hebrew Bible. And people are starting thinking about, well, which books do I need? This is a critical book. The second book, the book that will facilitate understanding of what's done in the synagogue, is a book that I also mentioned earlier, the Chumash. This is a book of the synagogue readings. It's divided by week. And so for this week, there's a selection of from Pinchas, which has the Torah portion for Pinchas. It has the Haftarah for Pinchas, and it has a little commentary below it to help understand things in the scripture that might seem strange, or to help pull out the deeper points, maybe help a rabbi who still doesn't have a sermon written for Saturday figure out what he's going to say on Saturday. This is so this copy is the new Eitz Chaim Chumash, which is 30 years old by now. But this is a contemporary Chumash, which has the entire synagogue readings to it and is really indispensable for navigating the Hebrew Bible as it is used in the synagogue. There are many great academic series of the Hebrew Bible, if you want to read them about them in depth. I mean, a favorite one of mine is the Anchor Bible series. And if you look at the picture here, every one of those huge volumes is one book of the Hebrew Bible. So those are the blue ones. There's also a Christian one in there, which is red. So I mean, you can read whatever you want to. For purposes of this one, for purposes of this class, we're sticking with the blue ones, which are the Hebrew Bible. And the every one, so there's 20, there's like 40 of them that go through in depth all of the books of the Hebrew Bible, the history, the context, the difficulties reading it. It's a scholarly introduction, an in-depth introduction to the Hebrew Bible as a discipline. And there are other series, some are better than others. I recommend the Anchor Bible as a starter series if that's something you want to do. I don't own all of them. I usually just buy the ones that I like, or the ones that I'm studying in a couple different series. I have a pretty eclectic collection of books. I wanted to close with talking a little bit about the Hebrew Bible in Israel. As I mentioned, as we will talk about when we talk about it, one of the amazing things about Israel is that in order to have the country, the Hebrew language had to be revived. that Hebrew was a literary language. It was a living language in the time of the Bible was written. It was probably a living language a little bit at the time that the rabbis lived. But following the destruction of the temple by the Romans and the dispersion of Jews out of our land, we lost the ability to write grocery lists in Hebrew, to tuck our kids in Hebrew. We spoke the vernacular, and Hebrew was a language of study and worship. It's not a living language. When Hebrew was revived at the end of the 19th century, it drew very heavily upon the biblical level of the language, so that there was sort of like a parlor game in Israel. If Isaiah the prophet came back and was walking down the streets of Tel Aviv, would people be able to understand his Hebrew, and would he be able to understand the other people's Hebrew? Well, probably not. But it's probably wouldn't be completely incomprehensible either. I mean, to live in Israel where Hebrew is the language, there are so many idioms, so many passages that Israelis just know that it is really, and they come up in all different circumstances, not just in religious circumstances, that every tract of education in Israel, whether it's secular, whether it's Haredi, whether it's traditional, is based on the Hebrew Bible. And on Israeli Independence Day, the highlight of Independence Day is a Bible contest, the Chidun HaTanakh, the examination of the Bible, where Jews from all over the world, but mostly from Israel, gather and they're quizzed on like a 3-hour show that's broadcast in Israel. It's what everyone is watching. You can see the prime minister, this is from a few years ago, the former prime minister was there. The future prime minister was also there. And that the heart of Israeli society is this identification with the Hebrew Bible, with the book of books. And it has the revival of Israel and the revival of the Hebrew language has created a world in which the Hebrew Bible lives in a way that it hadn't lived for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so before I go, and I'll stay around for questions, but are we the people of the book? And the question, the answer is mostly no. And that sort of the spoiler for next time is that the Bible, as great as it is, as wondrous as it is, it was really my first introduction. It was something that I've studied for years. I got a fellowship to study the Hebrew Bible at the University of Pennsylvania. That's how much I was taken with it. I decided to go to rabbinical school instead. But the Bible is not the main curriculum of traditional Judaism. As we talked, and when I introduced it, one term for the Hebrew Bible is the written Torah, the Torah that's written down. The main text of Jewish expression are the ones that we're going to do in the next class. The Mishnah and the Talmud, the rabbinic literature, the oral Torah is in fact our distinctive literary tradition, but you can't start there. You have to start with the Hebrew Bible. But when we arrive to the next class, with the help of God, I will take you through that literature, and our next topic will be how the rabbis expanded the written Torah, the Hebrew Bible, into the literary corpus that is the foundation of Judaism. And I finished 6 minutes early. That's you're welcome. And but I'll be I'd love to know what you are thinking. I'd love to know what your questions are. What is confusing, what is reassuring, what is troubling, what's up.
I would venture to say that most American Jews, except for the very Orthodox, know very, very little Hebrew. And it shouldn't be it shouldn't be an obstacle, although it's a difficult language to learn if you didn't grow up with it. But even if you know one word in Hebrew, it just opens up so much more meaning because it's a very rich language, opens up so much more meaning to the translations that you run across.
Yes, I very, very well said. It is the difficulty where we are now with Hebrew in the American community. It's difficult. I don't. We're committed at our synagogue to prayer in Hebrew. We're committed to study that at least touches base with the Hebrew, if it's not conducted in Hebrew. But you're absolutely correct that not everyone is going to get to the point where they have a great facility with it. But every little word counts. Every little bit is a discovery, and that's exactly the attitude to have. Michael.
Rabbi, I have several responses to services at once. One is a religious response, but another is an aesthetic response. I find the services to be beautiful. And a large part of that beauty has to do with the beauty of the Hebrew language. It's internal rhymes, it's formally beautiful. And so I'd be interested in what you have to say about the aesthetics of our services, either now or later.
It's part of what I've lost sometimes, but I try to remember it, is the experience of being in them and not knowing what was going on, and even not knowing that I was seeing something that was beautiful, something that was majestic, something that was important. So it's when you spend 30 years studying anything, you can lose the romance. You can lose the romance a little bit, but I still feel sometimes that I'm overcome by that. The fact is that in terms of again, I've been studying it for decades. I know quite a bit. But between when you consider everything that's out there, when you consider the great size of our canon, our literature, our laws, our interpretations, the distance between somebody who knows a lot and someone who doesn't know a lot, relative to the ocean, is not that great. We're both on. We're all just at the very edge of something that's more vast than we can even comprehend. And it's the experience of being next to that, and that is important. I think it's valuable to learn as much as we can. Don't get me wrong. I work hard. I work hard at that still. But to me, it's like science. I was a scientist before I entered rabbinical school, and some people know a lot about science. Some people know the mathematics very well. Some people might not know that much, but compared to the vastness of the cosmos, the gradations among what different humans know is not that great. We're all very small, and we all have the opportunity to stand in front of something that's huge and beautiful, and that we're never going to master. Not if we had we couldn't master it. I couldn't master if I had 10 lifetimes.
So this is a silly question, but is it necessary to be a good singer to be a rabbi?
Well, my rabbi couldn't carry a tune if his, I mean, the guy who was my rabbi in Philadelphia, he couldn't control his pitch if his life depended on it and the lives of all his entire congregation depended on it. So no, you don't have to have a good voice to be a rabbi, or at least you didn't have to, with all of the downsizing today. I mean, the synagogues tend to want everything. You really, if you don't play the guitar and a few other instruments, I think communities are suspicious about whether or not you really belong. But there's I mean, there are plenty of rabbis that have challenges with their voices. And
We're extraordinarily lucky.
Hmm?
We're extraordinarily lucky at Beth Israel.
We love to sing here. We love to sing here, and we have a lot of people that are devoted to the music. That's one of the things that, I mean, I hate to. I don't want there to be anything good to come out of the pandemic because I'm so upset about it. But we did learn some interesting things being on Zoom. And we got so many comments from so many different people about the services, and not people that knew Hebrew or they weren't even Jewish, but they just said that what you guys are doing, we find it so beautiful. And and I think that was part of that was the competence that we do it, but I think part of it was they see our dedication to doing something that's unusual and different and hard. And they see the devotion to which this community, the resources that this community devotes to being able to do that. And I think that moves people. It moves me. It moves me.
Rabbi, could you put on the screen again the pages we're supposed to read for different weeks?
I can.
Thank you.
Well, I should say I will endeavor to. The computer does its own. There, I think so. For the next class, when we study, we're going to talk about the rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and the Talmud. That'll be pages 92 through 118 in Dosek. And then then it's just going to be chapter four and chapter 4 for the final 3 classes of the summer term, because we're going to talk about the calendar and holidays. So
thank you.
well, I will thank you for coming to the class tonight, and I look forward to seeing those of you that I'll see in synagogue, and for those of you that I'll see here in 2 weeks. I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks for our next class. Everybody have a lovely evening, please. Take care.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Night.